They say that the cracks in a marriage don't appear all at once. They form silently, almost politely, beneath the surface, like tiny fractures in porcelain, barely noticeable until the whole thing shatters in your hands. Looking back now, I realize those cracks began forming long before I saw anything on the security camera. At first, it was just the silence, not the heavy, hostile kind that lingers after a fight, but the quieter, more insidious kind that seeps into the corners of everyday life. Emily and I had once talked about everything, plans for the future, silly observations, inside jokes whispered in the kitchen. But in recent months, the words between us had become measured, transactional. Conversations had been replaced by updates. Jokes were replaced by reminders. Love by routine. I told myself it was normal. After 10 years of marriage, no couple stays in that newlywed phase. Life creeps in: work, deadlines, fatigue. I blamed the economy, her demanding job in finance, my own long hours debugging lines of stubborn code as a software engineer. But beneath the logic, I felt it. A slow erosion of something sacred between us. And still, I refused to look too closely. I let the excuses cushion the unease. Emily had always been ambitious, driven. She thrived on challenges, late nights at the firm, her name attached to major accounts. I admired that about her once. But in the past 6 months, her dedication became almost religious. She was working later than ever before, sometimes not returning home until 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes not at all. I told myself she was chasing a promotion. I told myself I trusted her. And in many ways, I did. At least, I thought I did. We had no children. That was a choice at first. Then it became a matter of circumstance, then convenience, and finally, avoidance. The space between us grew quieter without a child's laughter to fill it. We had Milo, our golden retriever. He seemed to notice the shift before I did. He'd often sit near the front door late at night, ears perked, waiting for Emily. When she didn't return, he would curl up beside me on the couch, sighing like an old soul. One Thursday evening in early October, the quiet became too much. I had been reviewing some recent freelance contract work, double-checking a client's request for integrating their software system with a cloud monitoring tool. To do that properly, I needed to make sure my own security infrastructure was operating efficiently. I had installed a fairly sophisticated smart surveillance system around the house, partly out of habit, partly because I enjoyed tinkering. Emily had always laughed at how serious I was about it. That night, I noticed the system logs had been behaving oddly. The external cameras had recorded several motion alerts in the past week that I hadn't received. Thinking it was a glitch in the software, I pulled up the archive to analyze the footage. My plan was to check the timestamps and recalibrate the motion sensors. But what I saw left me cold. The first oddity was on September 28th. It was a Wednesday. Emily had told me she'd be staying overnight for a major presentation. She hadn't come home, but the footage told a different story. At 2:17 a.m., the backyard gate opened. The night vision mode showed the figure clearly: Emily. She was wearing a different outfit than what she had worn to work. Not the fitted blazer and pencil skirt she'd left in that morning, but something casual. She moved quickly, carefully, and entered through the sliding door. No lights came on. She walked with purpose into the living room, carrying what looked like a pair of heels in her hand. Then the feed cut off as she moved out of frame. I sat there frozen, my cursor blinking in silence. I checked the hallway camera. Nothing. She had avoided the main motion sensors completely, moving through blind spots like she had mapped them out, like she didn't want to be seen. I went back through the logs. The following Sunday, another alert, 2:41 a.m. this time, she came in through the front. Again, no lights, again, not the clothes she had left in that morning. She went straight to the bedroom and left before dawn. I had been asleep that night. I hadn't even stirred. I closed my laptop and just stared at the black screen for what felt like hours. My heart wasn't racing. It was doing something worse. It was sinking with the weight of uncertainty, of betrayal, of denial unraveling. But I still tried to explain it away. Maybe she forgot something. Maybe it wasn't as it seemed. Maybe she was avoiding waking me. Maybe. The human mind is a master of rationalization when it's trying to protect the heart. The following day, I did what any engineer would do. I upgraded the system. I recalibrated the motion sensitivity, updated the firmware, expanded the storage capacity, and enabled cloud syncing of all video archives. Then I set it to notify my phone with every movement, every trigger. I didn't want to miss anything again. It was strange, knowing something was wrong but not knowing what. It's a kind of emotional purgatory. I began watching her differently, not in a paranoid way, at least not yet, but with heightened awareness. The way she picked at her dinner, the way she avoided eye contact, the way she always seemed half-present, like her thoughts were elsewhere. I began to catalog moments. When she smiled too easily at a text. When she claimed she had back-to-back meetings but her calendar said otherwise. When she told me she'd be home late because of an internal audit, but I saw no trace of it in the company's public filings. A few days later, I caught a clip from the living room cam. It was 3:08 a.m. Emily again slipping into the house like a ghost, but this time she wasn't alone. The man with her was tall, dressed in dark jeans and a sweatshirt. I couldn't make out his face. The camera caught only a partial angle, a side profile at best. They didn't speak, at least not audibly. They didn't linger. They moved through the house swiftly and silently. She led him into the kitchen, then toward the hallway. The feed ended. I felt something collapse inside of me. It wasn't rage. It wasn't jealousy. It was something duller, a kind of spiritual fatigue. Like watching a bridge you built with your bare hands collapse into the river below while you stood helpless on the bank. The betrayal wasn't just about what she had done, it was about the effort she had made to hide it. The deception, the strategy, the forethought. She hadn't just stumbled into an affair. She had orchestrated it, planned it, executed it beneath the nose of a man who trusted her enough to not question her absences. For days after that, I didn't confront her. I couldn't. I still woke beside her in bed, still made coffee for two, still listened to her talk about work like nothing was wrong. I answered her questions. I smiled in all the right places. I performed normalcy like a man sleepwalking. And each night I watched. I watched her arrive home later than necessary. I watched the cameras blink. I watched the ghosts return. People think betrayal feels like an explosion, a burst of fire, an eruption of screaming and slamming doors, but that wasn't how it happened for me. For me, betrayal was quiet, cold, sterile. It was a camera lens catching the truth in grayscale silence. It was the blinking red light in the corner of a ceiling. It was a time-stamped notification on a phone screen at 3:14 a.m. It was the realization that the person you loved had become a stranger in your own home. And I hadn't even scratched the surface of what was coming next. It's unsettling how quickly the mind can begin to normalize the unimaginable. Within a week of discovering Emily's secret movements through our house, I had already adapted to a new way of living, one in which I was no longer simply a husband, but a quiet observer, a reluctant archivist of betrayal. I began collecting timestamps instead of memories, watching shadows instead of smiles. There was a time when I used to wait for her at the front door, Milo curled beside me, tail wagging every time he thought he heard her car. That version of me, the optimistic, unsuspecting version, felt like a stranger now. That man hadn't just disappeared, he had been peeled away layer by layer, replaced with someone colder, sharper, more clinical. I no longer waited for her. I watched her. In my efforts to understand what I was truly dealing with, I became obsessed with the little details. I went back into the security footage, scanning every segment I could find where she returned home at strange hours. Most of the time, the house was quiet, the footage mundane. But then I found something different, something subtle yet unmistakable. It was a Tuesday night, sometime around 1:45 a.m. The outside camera caught her stepping into the frame from the rear alley. She was alone this time, but what caught my attention was her appearance. Her hair was different, styled, but not in a way she wore it for work. Her outfit was unfamiliar to me, more casual, more deliberately chosen, but it wasn't just that. In her hand, she held a pair of heels, red, glossy, unmistakably bold. I didn't recognize them. The realization was as sharp as a knife. She had another life, a parallel world that I didn't belong to. The heels weren't just shoes. They were evidence of a persona that existed beyond our marriage, an Emily who dressed for someone else, smiled at someone else, touched someone else. The woman I slept next to each night wasn't the whole truth. She was a partial portrait, a curated mask. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, watching her movements on loop. How she walked with quiet confidence, how she took deliberate care to avoid triggering hallway sensors, how she tiptoed into our shared space like a stranger breaking into her own life. Nothing about it was spontaneous. It was choreographed, practiced. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed beside her, listening to her breathing, the faint rhythm of sleep that sounded too peaceful, too indifferent. I stared at the ceiling, and my mind wandered to memories, small, insignificant moments that now seemed laced with warning signs. The times she turned away from my touch. The new perfume I had noticed weeks earlier but didn't question. The locked drawer in her study she claimed was filled with confidential work documents. I had never thought of myself as the jealous type. Jealousy was for the insecure, the uncertain. I was analytical by nature, methodical, but this wasn't jealousy, it was grief. I was mourning the death of something sacred, something that once felt invincible. And in its place was a kind of emotional rigor mortis, cold, stiff, unmoving. The next morning I woke up before her and stared at the morning light slipping through the blinds. I made coffee the same way I always did, 2 cups, one with almond milk and a touch of cinnamon. Hers. The absurdity of it struck me. How easily we perform routine even when our lives are burning beneath the surface. She came into the kitchen half awake, took the cup without a word, kissed me on the cheek like nothing had changed. That day I searched the house. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, maybe proof, maybe closure, maybe just a crack in the facade that would help me decide what to do next. I started in her study. She was meticulous, but even the most careful people leave traces. I opened drawers, checked behind books, scanned old receipts she had thrown away. Nothing incriminating, nothing that pointed clearly to an affair. Just ordinary clutter, the kind that had once felt intimate but now felt foreign. Then I remembered the red heels. I went to our bedroom closet. Her section was neatly arranged, suits, blouses, shoes aligned like soldiers. I scanned each row until I found them, the heels, tucked at the back, almost hidden. The tags were still attached, the soles nearly unworn. They weren't part of her professional wardrobe. They were new. They were secret. I held one in my hand, felt the weight of it. It wasn't just leather and stitching. It was a symbol, a cipher, a key to a world I had never been invited into. Later that night, she came home late again, said it was another client meeting that had run over. She smelled faintly of alcohol and something floral I couldn't place. She went straight to the shower. I watched her walk away and realized something painful. I no longer felt anything. Not anger, not desire, just absence, like I was watching a ghost walk through the ruins of our life. In the days that followed, I found myself operating on autopilot. I went to work, fulfilled my tasks, smiled at colleagues, but I was somewhere else entirely. I became obsessed with the footage, analyzing frame by frame, tracking timelines, comparing appearances. I created a spreadsheet to catalog her movements, cross-referenced them with her calendar entries and text logs when I could glimpse them. The patterns were clear. She was living 2 lives. I began noticing other details, too, subtle things. The way she always took her calls in the garden now, claiming poor reception. The way she locked her phone more frequently. The way her wardrobe had quietly shifted, new items I hadn't seen before, tags that had been hastily removed and stuffed in the trash. It was like watching someone slowly slip out of a disguise they had grown tired of wearing. One evening, while organizing the old photos in the attic, I stumbled across a picture from our honeymoon. We were in Venice, standing on a balcony overlooking the Grand Canal, the sunset painting everything gold. She was laughing, her head tilted back, my arm wrapped around her waist. We looked happy. We were happy. I held that photo in my hands and tried to reconcile it with the woman I now shared a home with. I couldn't. The distance between who we had been and who we had become was too vast, too final. I began thinking about my own role in all of this. Had I been inattentive? Had I withdrawn too much into my work? Had I failed to make her feel loved, seen, wanted? These questions haunted me more than anything I had seen on camera, because I realized something brutal. Betrayal doesn't always come from hate. Sometimes it grows in the spaces where love has gone silent. And yet, even with that understanding, I couldn't forgive what I had seen. I couldn't erase the image of her moving like a stranger through our home. I couldn't ignore the evidence I had collected, the entries, the inconsistencies, the red heels waiting patiently in the dark. I hadn't confronted her yet because I didn't know what I wanted. Did I want an apology, an explanation? Did I want to scream, to cry, to demand she leave? Or did I want to give her the chance to lie to my face just to see if she would? What I wanted more than anything was to wake up and find none of it had been real. To find that the footage was a mistake, that the man was a cousin, a friend, anyone but what I feared. I wanted to believe in the version of Emily I had fallen in love with, but that version was gone. The woman who stood beside me each morning wasn't my wife. Not really. She wore the same face, used the same voice, but the spirit had shifted. There was a distance in her eyes, a calculation in her timing, a hollowness in her touch. I could no longer deny what I was seeing. The quiet drift had become a chasm, and I was standing on the edge of it, staring into something I couldn't fix. Still, I waited for the final piece, the undeniable confirmation, the moment that would force truth into the open. I didn't have to wait long. It came on a night when she claimed she'd be at a financial networking dinner, said she'd be out late, told me not to wait up. But the cameras were waiting, and what they recorded that night would change everything. They say the truth sets you free, but that's not quite right. The truth doesn't liberate, it obliterates. It doesn't gently guide you out of darkness. It scorches your illusions to ash and forces you to stand, naked and raw, in the cruel light of reality. And once it arrives, nothing can return to what it was. The night she said she had a financial networking dinner, I didn't question it aloud. I played my part. I nodded, feigned concern for her long hours, told her to take care. But inside, my thoughts coiled into something cold and calculated. I had become a man living in two simultaneous versions of reality, the one I presented to her and the one I lived in silence. That second version had become my true home. I prepped the cameras before she left. I checked angles, cleared caches, recalibrated recording delays, and set up my laptop to stream the feeds directly to my phone in real time. The system had become my closest confidant, more trustworthy than the woman I'd shared a bed with for nearly a decade. She left at 6:42 p.m., wearing a fitted emerald dress I had never seen before and lipstick darker than usual. It was subtle, but I noticed. My memory had become photographic. She didn't take her usual route downtown. The car's GPS history showed a different path, one that ended in a quiet cul-de-sac about 30 minutes away from the financial district. I watched on the exterior driveway cam as a silver sedan pulled up around 7:19 p.m. She stepped out, smiling, confident. She walked to the front door of a modern, two-story house and knocked as if it were familiar. Seconds later, the door opened. A man stepped out, mid-30s, tall, with short, dark hair. There was no hesitation, no awkward pause, no platonic restraint. It was intimate, so intimate it burned. They stepped inside together, the door shutting behind them. I sat there in the dark of our living room, Milo at my feet, my hands trembling not with rage, but something more paralyzing, vindication. I had known. I had gathered data, analyzed timelines, tested hypotheses. But knowing and seeing are two very different things. One occupies your mind, the other infects your soul. I stared at the closed door on the live feed and realized I didn't need to know what happened inside. I already knew. The theater of it was unnecessary. The betrayal was complete the moment she stepped into that house like she belonged there. My imagination filled in the rest, far more vividly than any camera could capture. But part of me still wanted certainty, a dark, obsessive part that needed undeniable, unarguable proof, so I waited and watched. At 10:03 p.m., the door opened again. She emerged, laughing. The man followed, standing close to her. He reached for her hand, but she pulled it away playfully, looking around before stepping toward the curb. He kissed her cheek. She lingered. Then she walked back to her car, the emerald dress catching the porch light like it was made of glass. When she returned home at 10:48 p.m., she walked in with the calmness of routine. She kicked off her shoes by the door, walked past the camera in the hallway, and entered the kitchen. I watched her pour a glass of wine and lean against the counter, checking her phone, smiling to herself. That smile, it wasn't the kind of smile you wear after a dull networking event. It was soft, private. The smile of someone carrying a secret too lovely to share. I stayed in the living room, just out of frame. I listened to her footsteps, the gentle clink of the glass, the slow pad of her socks on tile. I didn't move, didn't confront. I just listened to the house breathe around her, watched her shadows play across the wall as if I were studying a stranger in their natural habitat. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, 1,000 memories collapsing inward like a dying star. I thought about the house we bought together, the color we picked for the walls, the anniversary trip we postponed and never rescheduled. I thought about the night she held my hand at my father's funeral, whispered that we were in this life together. I thought about the time I had the flu and she stayed up all night reading to me from my favorite book. Were those moments lies too? Or did they simply belong to a different version of her, a version I buried without realizing? The following day was a blur. I went through the motions of work without absorbing a single thing. My fingers typed. My eyes stared at code, but my mind was far away, trapped in that moment outside the stranger's house, replaying the embrace on loop. I couldn't concentrate. My reality had split. One part of me was still pretending, still performing, while the other was collapsing inward under the weight of truth. I started researching divorce attorneys, quietly, methodically. I wasn't ready to pull the trigger, but I needed to know what was ahead. I read testimonials, reviewed options for discreet consultations, took screenshots, and saved numbers to an encrypted file. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with this knowledge yet, but it felt like armor, preparation. The first steps toward reclaiming my agency. By now, I had stopped pretending there was any other explanation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a phase. It wasn't a one-time mistake. It was deliberate, sustained. hidden behind a facade of weary workdays and delayed meetings, and I had helped her keep it intact with my silence, my denial, my desperate hope that she would return to the woman I once knew. But she wasn't coming back. That woman no longer existed. As days passed, the silence between us thickened. She moved through the house with practiced grace, unaware that her stage was being watched. She made dinner. She asked about my day. She kissed me goodnight with lips that had touched someone else hours before, and I let her. Not because I forgave her, but because I wanted to see how long she would maintain the performance. I noticed small changes. Her phone, once casually placed on counters and coffee tables, was now always in her pocket or turned face down. She started showering immediately upon returning home, even when it was late. Her excuses became more rehearsed, more perfect, but perfection is its own form of suspicion. The camera footage continued to grow. I cataloged everything: dates, times, duration, expressions, details. I built a private archive, a quiet library of my own unraveling. Not because I needed the proof, but because part of me wanted to bear witness to the full scope of the lie. I didn't want to look away. I wanted to know exactly how she had killed our marriage. One night I found myself staring at our wedding album. It had collected dust on the top shelf, unopened for years. I flipped through the pages slowly, each one a cruel contrast to the footage stored on my server. The vows we wrote, the way she looked at me, the words she had whispered when no one else was listening. I had believed every one of them. It was then that the grief finally reached me, not in tears but in stillness, a heavy, immovable stillness that spread through my chest like ice. I wasn't just grieving the loss of a partner. I was grieving the loss of a shared life, of the imagined future we had woven together. Vacations never taken, children never born, conversations never had. I realized I hadn't been fighting to save our marriage. I had been fighting to preserve my memory of it. I needed to stop watching. I needed to decide. So I sat down and drafted a letter, not to her, to myself. I wrote down every truth I had learned, every red flag I had ignored, every timestamp that had replaced trust. I listed them like bullet points in a final report, and at the end I wrote a single sentence: "This is not love anymore." I saved the letter in a folder labeled "Closure." And then I shut off the cameras. Not because I forgave her, not because I believed she would change, but because I no longer wanted to live as a ghost in my own home, haunting myself with surveillance. She had already betrayed me. I didn't need to keep documenting the crime. I needed to prepare for the trial. The time for watching was over. The time for confronting had arrived. There's a strange kind of peace that descends when you know something has ended. Not the loud, jarring kind that comes from slamming doors or shouting matches, but the quieter one, the peace of finality. The stillness that follows when you've seen the worst and accepted it. When you've crossed the threshold where hope used to live and all that remains is clarity. After I shut off the cameras, I spent 3 days in silence. Not literal silence. I still moved through the house, still responded when spoken to, still performed the rituals of a functioning husband. But inside, I was utterly quiet. I was no longer gathering evidence. I was no longer searching for truth. I had already seen it. I had archived it. And now I was preparing for the end. I didn't rush the confrontation. I wanted to enter it fully grounded, not in rage, not in sorrow, but in resolve. I spent my evenings going over the same footage, not to punish myself, but to affirm that I wasn't imagining it, that I wasn't projecting or overreacting, that what I had witnessed was, in fact, betrayal. I took screenshots. I organized timestamps. I printed copies of the most damning footage, still frames, dates, context. I stored everything in a slim folder labeled with only her name, not to use against her, but to guard against gaslighting. I knew how the mind can bend under pressure, how truth can be reshaped in the hands of a manipulator. I wanted to be sure I never doubted what I had seen. I wanted a record of the devastation she caused. I kept the folder in my desk drawer for 2 days. I thought about whether to show it to her, whether to confront her with the weight of her actions, the cold, unarguable facts of what she had done. But as the days passed, I realized I didn't need to show her anything. This wasn't about catching her in a lie anymore. This was about reclaiming my own narrative, about stepping away from the wreckage with dignity. But fate, as it often does, intervened. It was a Friday evening when the final crack formed. She came home earlier than usual, flustered, distracted. I knew instantly that something was off, not because of anything obvious, but because of what was missing. Her lies were usually seamless, practiced, but that night she seemed careless, like she was preoccupied, like something had disrupted the rhythm of her deceit. And then I saw it, Her phone buzzed on the counter as she walked into the other room. She never left her phone out of reach anymore. Never. But this time it sat there, screen illuminated, vibrating quietly. I looked. The name on the screen was his. I recognized it from one of the metadata logs I had intercepted. The same man from the house, the same man from the car, the same man she thought I'd never know about. He had texted her a photo of them together smiling. It wasn't lewd or explicit, it was worse than that. It was casual, domestic, the kind of photo couples take when they think they're safe, the kind of photo that speaks of familiarity, comfort, shared routines. He had captioned it simply with a heart. In that moment, I felt nothing. Not pain, not betrayal. Just detachment. I knew what I had to do. That night after she fell asleep, I went into the study. I opened the folder I had prepared. I printed one more page, a copy of that message with the photo. I added it to the stack. Then I drafted a single-page letter. It was not angry, it was not bitter, it was precise. I wrote what I had seen, what I had documented, what I knew. I wrote that I would not scream, that I would not beg. I wrote that I deserved better. And then I left it all on the kitchen table. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch with Milo, the cool autumn air brushing against my face like a silent witness. The city lights flickered in the distance. Somewhere life went on, but for me the axis had shifted. My marriage had ended, not with a bang, not with a fight, but with a folder and a truth too heavy to ignore. In the morning I was already dressed when she came downstairs. She looked groggy, confused. I watched from the hallway as she noticed the papers, as she reached for them, as her fingers paused on the first page. And then I walked away. I didn't wait for tears. I didn't wait for denial. I didn't need to hear the excuses, the explanations, the desperate half-truths disguised as apologies. She had already told me everything I needed to know. Not in words, but in red heels, in time-stamped entrances, in 1,000 small choices made behind my back. The next few weeks were a blur of logistics. I stayed with a friend while the paperwork began. She emailed me, texted me, tried to call. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The lawyers handled the rest. I returned once to collect my belongings. The house felt different, emptier, colder, like the ghost of our marriage still lingered in the walls, watching, waiting. I took only what was mine: clothes, books, Milo, who followed me without hesitation. He had always known. Animals have a way of sensing brokenness before we do. I left the wedding album behind. I couldn't carry it with me. Not because it wasn't real once, but because what it had symbolized no longer existed. I found a small apartment downtown, nothing fancy, but it was mine. The silence there was different, less haunted, more honest. I began rebuilding my routines: long walks, quiet dinners, mornings without pretense, evenings without surveillance. Slowly, the air around me began to feel breathable again. People often ask what the hardest part of betrayal is. It's not the lie. It's the moment you realize you ignored the truth for far too long. I think back to the man I was before the cameras, before the late nights, before the emerald dress and the text messages. He was trusting, steady, willing to give the benefit of the doubt. That man died quietly. In his place stands someone else, someone more cautious, more observant. Not bitter, but changed. And while I can't say I'm grateful for the pain, I can say this: the truth once faced has a strange kind of mercy. It clears the rubble, it raises the illusions, and in its place it plants something harder, more honest, more enduring. I no longer live in a house built on secrets. I no longer share a life with someone who walks like a stranger in the night. I live with truth now, and while it is lonely, it is also clean. Time passes differently after you lose everything you thought was solid. It stops marking itself in birthdays, anniversaries, and Sunday brunches. Instead, it starts measuring in small milestones. The first morning you wake up and forget to feel hollow. The first night you fall asleep without looping old footage in your mind. The first time you see her name on your phone and feel nothing but indifference. Grief is not loud. It's not the storm people imagine. It doesn't always crash down on you in one dramatic wave. Sometimes it seeps. It lingers in coffee mugs she once used, in songs that randomly play in the grocery store in a certain way the sunlight slants across an empty pillow. But grief is also honest. It demands no lies. and unlike betrayal, it won't whisper behind your back. The divorce finalized in the spring. There was no courtroom drama, no custody battles, no drawn-out fight over property. We split things cleanly as two people who no longer had the energy to pretend. The hardest part was signing my name on a stack of papers that read like an obituary for a life once imagined. Still, when the documents arrived in the mail, I felt no sting, only quiet and a strange, unfamiliar lightness. I kept the folder for a while, tucked in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet beneath tax forms and expired warranties. Not because I still needed it, but because part of me wasn't ready to destroy it yet. It had been a compass through the storm, a map of what was true, but eventually even compasses become burdens. One morning in May, I took it out for the last time. I flipped through the stills, the logs, the screenshots that once anchored me in certainty. I paused over the photo he sent her, that smiling, casual portrait that had once felt like a bullet to the chest. Now it looked like a postcard from someone else's life. I fed the pages into a shredder slowly, piece by piece. The machine hummed with finality, chewing through the evidence like a mouth devouring the past. When I reached the letter I had written to myself, the one that ended with the sentence, "This is not love anymore," I hesitated. Then I folded it, placed it in an envelope, and slid it into the back of my journal. Not as a scar, but as a reminder, I had survived. In the months that followed, I began to breathe again. Not just inhale and exhale, but truly breathe, without constriction, without heaviness. I stopped scanning every room for surveillance. I stopped checking every silence for hidden meaning. I even stopped checking her social media, which had once been a masochistic habit. I realized I didn't care where she was anymore. That world, that version of me had collapsed, and I had crawled out of the wreckage still intact. I filled my life with quiet things, long walks with Milo, who had aged faster than I'd noticed, mornings at a local cafe where nobody knew my story, a pottery class I took on a whim just to feel clay between my fingers instead of glass screens and keyboard plastic. I stopped coding after hours. I stopped filling every moment with work. I let myself be still. People came and went. Friends tried to understand, but most couldn't. They meant well, but some asked the wrong questions. Why didn't you confront her sooner? Did you ever suspect before the cameras? Do you think she loved him? I answered politely when I had to, but mostly I let the questions pass. Because the truth wasn't something I could package neatly. It wasn't a headline, it wasn't a cautionary tale. It was mine, and it didn't need explaining. Then one Saturday afternoon in late July, something happened. I was browsing in a small bookstore near my apartment. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just wandering. The air smelled like paper and dust and time. I turned a corner and nearly collided with someone. She apologized. I stepped back. Our eyes met briefly, and for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't flinch. She wasn't stunning in the cinematic sense, but there was a calmness in her face that struck me, something grounded. A gentleness not shaped by perfection, but by understanding. She wore no makeup. Her hair was tucked behind her ears. She looked like someone who had known grief and survived it. We didn't exchange numbers. We didn't arrange coffee. It wasn't that kind of moment. But it was a moment. The kind that reminds you the world still turns, that not every story ends in betrayal, that there might be chapters left unwritten, and maybe someday someone will walk in who doesn't lie with their hands or their eyes or their silences. I went home that day and opened a blank document on my laptop. For the first time in months, I began to write, not code, not spreadsheets, not divorce forms. Words, my own words, not about her, not about the cameras, but about healing, about honesty, about what it means to rebuild from nothing. The story started slow. A man sits alone in a quiet apartment. He doesn't speak. He observes. He learns how to trust his own instincts again. He doesn't look for love, but he doesn't close the door to it either. He simply lives, fully, deeply, quietly. Like me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't write to remember the pain. I wrote to honor the fact that I had come through it. The cameras are gone now. I dismantled them one by one. Not because I'm naive again, not because I believe betrayal is impossible, but because I no longer need to live in a house made of fear. I don't need lenses to verify truth. I don't need motion alerts to confirm my instincts. I trust myself now. And that perhaps is the greatest gift she never intended to give me. She broke the illusion, and in doing so she gave me back the most important thing I'd lost, my own clarity. Milo passed away in October. He was 12, old for a golden retriever. He went peacefully at home, his head resting in my lap. He had stayed with me through the worst. He had kept watch even when I couldn't. After I buried him, I walked the block twice, then came home and sat in silence. I cried, but not just for him. For everything. For the boy I used to be, full of trust. For the man who once believed love was unshakable. For the husband who waited by the door while someone else shared his wife's nights. And then I lit a candle. And I let the flame burn until nothing remained but wax and memory. Today I live differently. I don't look for signs. I don't chase shadows. I don't wonder where she is or who she's with. I wake up. I breathe. I make coffee for one. I water the plant that refuses to die in my windowsill. I write. And sometimes, just sometimes, I laugh without looking over my shoulder. Not every ending is loud. Some are quiet. Some come like a whisper in the dark. But if you listen closely, they still lead to light.